Under Assad's regime, not only were chemical weapons used, but there were torture camps in Syria too. An incident in Tunisia changed the Middle East forever. As a result, Syria turned into a deadly war zone. Many governments were deposed, and many dictators lost all authority. The condition was that Assad sent tanks to Daraa. Even services were banned because they were trouble spots for protests. This proved to be one of Assad's biggest mistakes. There was a rebellion within the army. So the Syrian army began losing their soldiers. This was the start of the civil war in Syria. On 8th December 2024, 63-year-old writer Bashar Barhoum woke up early in his prison in Syria. He had been in jail for the last 7 months, and this day was supposed to be his last. On this day, he was supposed to be executed. The thing is, Bashar Barhoum was a supporter of Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad. But some time ago, he gave a television interview where he criticized Iran. He accused Iran of exploiting the Syrians, and so he was thrown in jail. On the morning of the 8th of December, he was minutes away from his death. He knew the door would open soon, and the security forces would take him to his execution. But when the door finally opened, he noticed it wasn't the Syrian security forces. Instead, they were rebels opposing Assad. They were there to release him from jail. He was told that Assad's rule in Syria was now over and that the country was under the opposition forces' control. While people celebrated this good news, Barhoum couldn't find his cell phone and other belongings in the jail. He ran straight to his house to inform his wife and daughters that he was alive. His fate was truly amazing. Because of the fall of one government, Bashar Barhoum literally got a new life. But do you know what? Bashar Barhoum was not the only one. Many were supposed to be executed that day. In Syria's Sednaya prison, a child was also fated to be executed. The child was saved too. In today's discussion, let's get to know Bashar al-Assad's story, Syria's dictator, whom even ISIS couldn't defeat. But today, his dictatorship fell apart like a house of cards within 2 weeks. How did this happen? And what is going to happen to Syria now? This is the story of Syria's civil war. Before 1918, Syria was a part of the Ottoman Empire. Let's look at Syria's borders on the map today. Iraq is in its east, Jordan and Israel in the south, Lebanon in the west, and Turkey in the north. After defeating the Ottoman Empire in World War I, the European countries that had won the war took over this region and divided it among themselves. Syria went to France. So, from 1918 to 1946, France ruled this region. The citizens revolted against it, and after many wars, in 1946, Syria gained independence from France. But the problems began soon after independence. People believing in different religions and sects live in Syria. Look at its religious demographics. According to 2014 data, 74% of the people here believe in Sunni Islam. Approximately 16% believe in Shia Islam, and around 10% of the people are Christians. Out of these 16%, Shia Muslims, most of them, approximately 12%, are Alawites. Alawites belong to another religious sect. Some people believe it is completely different from Shia Islam. But on the other hand, some people believe it is a subsect of Shia Islam. This was the religious composition, but apart from this, based on ethnicity, there are two main groups in Syria: the Arabs and the Kurdish people. Around 74%, 70 to 80% are Arabs, and the Kurds make up about 10% of the Syrian population. When Syria gained independence, power went into the hands of the wealthy Sunni Arab landowners who were reluctant to share it with others. During this time, the Arab Socialist Ba'ath political party started gaining popularity. It was a secular and socialist party which attracted students, minorities, and young army officers. Many events took place in the first 10 to 15 years after independence. For instance, Syria participated in the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. In 1958, a union was formed between Egypt and Syria, creating a new country called the United Arab Republic. There were also numerous military coups in Syria in 1961, 1962, and 1963. Without delving into all the details, the March 1963 military coup brought Ba'ath Party supporters in the army to power. However, there was an internal power struggle within the party itself. This culminated in November 1970, when General Hafez al-Assad seized control. An ambitious minister of defense, Hafez al-Assad became Syria's president in 1971. He soon established a dictatorship in the country. Interestingly, despite being from the minority Alawite community in a Sunni Muslim-dominated country, he was popular among the masses. During his rule, there was economic development, land reforms, a strengthened military, and an emphasis on education. However, he was undoubtedly a cruel dictator. To consolidate power, he repressed his opponents. Anyone who raised their voice against him faced severe suppression. One notable example was the 1982 Hama massacre, where Sunni militants in Hama rebelled against Hafez al-Assad. In response, his military brutally killed 20,000 people. Over time, the Alawite community's control over Syria steadily increased. By the 1990s, Hafez was in poor health. His eldest son, Basil, was being groomed to succeed him as Syria's president. Basil was a charismatic and popular military figure. However, in 1994, he tragically died in a car accident. This unexpected event forced Hafez's younger son, Bashar al-Assad, to return from London, where he was studying to become an eye doctor. On June 10, 2000, Hafez al-Assad died of a heart attack, and Bashar al-Assad became Syria's new president. To facilitate this, Syria's constitution had to be amended. The original requirement was that the president must be at least 40 years old. Since Bashar was only 34, the age limit was reduced to 34. Once Bashar came to power, significant changes began to unfold. His father had governed Syria as a state-controlled economy. There was a system that guaranteed a government job to every college graduate, along with free services and affordable food for citizens. However, Bashar aimed to transition Syria to a market-oriented economy. Gradually, these guaranteed services were withdrawn. The unemployment rate began to rise. While the people had lived under a dictatorship, they were somewhat content due to development and education. But after 2000, as these services were phased out, the situation deteriorated. In 2006, Syria experienced a devastating drought that lasted for 4 years. This severe drought caused 60% of Syria's land to turn into deserts, and more than 80% of the cattle perished. Experts attributed this drought to climate change. Subsequently, Syria faced widespread desertification. The country had to start importing most of its food from other nations, leading to rising food prices and increased inflation. Additionally, Syria's oil reserves began depleting, reducing revenue from oil exports. As life became increasingly difficult, public dissatisfaction with Bashar al-Assad grew. On 17 December 2010, an incident in Tunisia triggered a historic change in the Middle East. In a small Tunisian city, Mohamed Bouazizi, a vegetable vendor, was stopped by the police, who confiscated his weighing scales because he lacked a permit. When he went to the provincial government to file a complaint, the governor refused to meet him. Frustrated and desperate, Mohamed Bouazizi set himself on fire in public. His tragic act was captured on video, which quickly went viral and caught international attention. This sparked mass protests in Tunisia, which soon escalated. Within a month, dictator Ben Ali's government was overthrown. Inspired by this display of people's power, Egyptians began protesting against their president, Hosni Mubarak, on 25 January 2011. By 11 February, Mubarak had resigned. The wave of protests continued to spread. Libya, under the dictatorship of Muammar Gaddafi, also witnessed unrest. Protests led to Gaddafi being captured and killed on the 20th of October 2011 after being found hiding in a drain. From 2010 to 2012, massive protests swept across many Arab countries. Several governments were overthrown and numerous dictators were deposed. Protests erupted in Morocco, Iraq, Algeria, Lebanon, Jordan, Kuwait, Oman, Sudan, and more. This movement became known as the Arab Spring. It was a wave of protests driven by similar issues: economic decline, rising corruption, unemployment, and inflation. The Arab Spring's impact was felt in Syria as well. Initially, Bashar al-Assad claimed that such protests would not occur in Syria, asserting that the country was immune to them. However, on the 6th of March 2011, the situation changed dramatically. In the small Syrian city of Deraa, teenage schoolboys wrote anti-government slogans on walls. One of the slogans read, "Ejak el dor, ya doctor," which meant, "It's your turn next, doctor." Assad, unwilling to tolerate dissent, responded harshly. The secret police arrested these children, who were imprisoned and subjected to torture. When their parents and neighbors sought their release, a government official coldly dismissed them, telling them to forget about the children. He further mocked them, saying, "If they want children, they should have more. And if they don't know how to have children, they should send their women to us. We will breed them." This sparked outrage, and protests erupted in the city. The day after this incident, thousands of people gathered to protest. In response, the Syrian army opened fire, killing 4 people. The protests intensified during the victims' funerals. On 23rd March, 15 protesters were killed, and hundreds were injured. The government further escalated the situation by cutting off water, electricity, and mobile networks in Deraa. Funerals were also banned as they had become focal points for protests. On 30th March 2011, Assad gave a speech labeling the protests a foreign-backed conspiracy, a common tactic of such regimes to discredit opposition. This only fueled the protests and intensified the government's crackdown. On 22nd April, hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets. Human rights groups reported that more than 100 protesters were killed. By 25th April, the situation in Deraa had deteriorated to the point where Assad deployed tanks against protesters. This marked the first use of tanks in the uprising. Reports emerged that many Syrian soldiers were refusing orders to fire on protesters, leading to a rebellion within the army. To maintain control, the Syrian army began executing its own soldiers. By July, so many soldiers had defected that they formed a separate army, the Free Syrian Army. This new force, along with protesters, shared a common goal: to free Syria from Assad's oppressive rule. Within months, the Free Syrian Army successfully pushed Assad's forces out of several parts of the country, capturing cities like Aleppo and Raqqa. This marked the beginning of the Syrian civil war. Experts noted that the chaos in Syria aligned perfectly with what extremist groups like al-Qaeda sought. The rebel factions, including the Free Syrian Army, formed the Syrian National Coalition, declaring themselves the legitimate government in exile. Countries such as the United States, Turkey, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates recognized this coalition. The rebels gained significant public support, and in August 2012, Syrian Prime Minister Riyad Hijab defected to join them. However, by this time, the civil war had devolved into a sectarian conflict. In 2011, the protests began as non-sectarian movements, focusing solely on opposing Assad and his government without targeting any specific religion or community. However, since Assad belonged to a minority group and had concentrated power within his community, tensions arose, especially since the majority of Syria's population were Sunni Muslims. Over time, this conflict evolved into a sectarian battle between Sunni Muslims and other Syrian minorities. These divisions deepened with foreign interventions. Countries like Turkey, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia, with Sunni-majority populations, supported the rebels. Even Hamas in Palestine shifted allegiance from Assad to the rebels. On the other hand, Iran and Hezbollah backed Assad due to their Shia majority base. By 2015, non-Muslim nations also joined the conflict. The US, Britain, France, and Germany supported the rebels, while Russia aligned with Assad. Numerous UN resolutions condemning Syria's crackdown were vetoed by Russia and China. The involvement of many nations was largely driven by the rise of ISIS. Around 2012, extremist militant groups entered the scene. In January 2012, Jabhat al-Nusra was established as al-Qaeda's Syrian franchise. The following month, al-Qaeda's leader called on Sunni Muslims to wage jihad against the Syrian government. Intriguingly, Assad contributed to this situation. In mid-2011, he released hundreds of extremist militants from prison. Although these individuals would oppose him, Assad aimed to create a narrative portraying himself as a secular leader fighting against jihadist forces, painting the rebels as extremists. Jabhat al-Nusra's power grew, while the Free Syrian Army weakened. The US refused to supply weapons to the Free Syrian Army, fearing they could fall into extremist hands. Meanwhile, Assad's forces intensified their attacks, using warplanes, missiles, and barrel bombs under the guise of combating terrorism. In December 2012, the US designated Jabhat al-Nusra as a terrorist organization, but this move sparked protests in Syria, where many accused Assad of being the true terrorist. On April 8, 2013, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi merged the Islamic State of Iraq with Jabhat al-Nusra, forming the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS, ISIL. During this period, chemical weapons were used against rebels. In April 2013, the US accused Syria of deploying chemical weapons like sarin gas, which causes paralysis and suffocation. International law strictly prohibits such weapons, even in warfare, yet they were repeatedly used against Syrian civilians. On 21 August 2013, over 1,000 people were killed in a chemical weapons attack. United Nations weapons inspectors visited Syria and gathered evidence confirming the use of sarin gas. The UN Secretary General labeled it a war crime. At the time, US President Barack Obama stated that this was a red line that should not have been crossed, implying that crossing it would prompt American military action. A red line for us is we start seeing a whole bunch of chemical weapons moving around or being utilized. That would change my calculations. That would change my equation, Obama said. Under Assad's rule, it wasn't just chemical weapons. Syria also had torture camps. One of the most notorious was Sednaya Prison, located on a hill near Damascus. Built in 1986, it became a primary detention center during the Civil War. Thousands of suspected rebel affiliates and individuals from protest areas were imprisoned there. Prisoners recounted brutal torture, including beatings with iron rods, cables, and electric sticks, being hung upside down, and being submerged in water. Talking among prisoners was prohibited. Conditions were so horrific that Amnesty International called it a human slaughterhouse. From 2011 to 2018, more than 30,000 people were killed in this prison. Meanwhile, the rule of ISIS was equally barbaric. By 2015, ISIS controlled about 1/3 of Syria and 40% of Iraq, declaring these areas as their caliphate with Raqqa in northern Syria as their capital. The ISIS-controlled territory functioned like an independent state, complete with its own government, laws, and currency, called the Islamic State currency. By the end of 2015, ISIS ruled a vast area where approximately 12 million people lived. ISIS committed genocide against minorities in these regions and destroyed hundreds of cultural heritage sites. Their war crimes were so severe that nearly every country condemned them. From the United Nations to nations like the USA, Russia, India, EU countries, Iraq, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Malaysia, Egypt, Singapore, Taiwan, China, and even Taliban-controlled Afghanistan, all declared ISIS a terrorist organization. To combat ISIS, the US and its allies directly intervened in the Syrian war with military force. Even Russia opposed ISIS and pledged to support the Syrian government in its fight against them. However, it later became evident that Russia, under the pretext of fighting ISIS, was also targeting rebels and civilians in Syria. This marked a point where the Syrian war became extremely complex. On one hand, the US and Russia were fighting. The US opposed Assad and supported the rebels, while Russia supported Assad. Yet both were combating ISIS. Meanwhile, the Syrian opposition, ISIS, and the Kurds were fighting Assad. Assad, the opposition, and the Kurds were also fighting ISIS. At the same time, Turkey got involved, opposing the Kurds due to long-standing hostilities. As the Kurds gained influence in Syria, Turkey started fighting them. This caused Turkey to clash with the US, which was supporting the Kurds. Iran and Hezbollah, both supporting Assad, were also fighting against ISIS. Consequently, Syria turned into a devastating war zone. This explains the widespread videos showing entire Syrian cities reduced to rubble, with only debris and abandoned buildings remaining. The destruction of so many cities led to the Syrian refugee crisis of 2015 to 16. Syria is miserable. We were escaping airstrikes, barrel bombs, and ISIL. We're tired. With so many groups and countries fighting in Syria, civilians had no safe space. By 2016, after a massive military campaign, the Syrian army reclaimed Aleppo from the rebels. Syrian army forces are now in control of more than 90% of the city since it began its operation to take back control of Aleppo. The US-led coalition launched thousands of airstrikes on ISIS, enabling Kurdish forces to nearly eliminate ISIS in northern Syria. In other regions, Assad's forces, backed by Russia, successfully overthrew ISIS. Similarly, in neighboring Iraq, the Iraqi army succeeded in their battle against ISIS, and Raqqa was recaptured. By 2019, ISIS was nearly wiped out except for a few areas. This map from March 2019 illustrates the situation. The yellow region in the north was under Kurdish control. The red areas were controlled by Assad's Syrian army, holding about two-thirds of the country. The green areas were controlled by the rebels, mainly based in the northwest near Idlib, with a small southern pocket. The black areas in the center represented ISIS-held territories, which were minimal by then. After ISIS's defeat, a stalemate emerged. The following years brought significant geopolitical shifts. In 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine, initiating the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war. Tensions between Russia and the West are growing rapidly. President Biden is considering deploying thousands of troops to Eastern Europe. In 2023, the Israel-Palestine war began, involving Hezbollah and Iran. Due to insufficient fighters, Hezbollah withdrew its forces from Syria. With Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah preoccupied, one might expect Bashar al-Assad to maintain the fragile peace in Syria. However, in November 2024, Assad's government resumed attacks on the rebels, a major misstep. On the 27th of November, the rebels launched a counter-offensive against the government. Initially planning a minor retaliation, they advanced rapidly when government forces retreated. By the 29th of November, the rebels reached Aleppo, Syria's largest city and economic hub. Lacking support from Russia and Iran, Assad's forces abandoned Aleppo on the 30th of November. Celebrating their victory, the rebel fighters are in the streets of Aleppo. The Syrian government clearly abandoned both weapons and ammunition in a hurry. On the loose, at peace. Sensing an opportunity, the rebels continued their offensive, seizing city after city. Russia attempted to aid Assad with airstrikes on rebel bases, but it was insufficient. Overstretched due to the Ukraine war, Russia lacked the resources to provide effective support. Their situation was so dire that they reportedly relied on importing troops from North Korea. The Prime Minister of the rebels' Syrian Salvation Government, al-Bashar, will lead this interim government. Bashar al-Assad's father was Syria's dictator for 30 years, followed by Assad himself, ruling as a dictator for 23 years. The Assad family's reign was long and powerful, yet it took only 2 weeks for their dictatorship to crumble like a house of cards. This is often how dictatorships collapse. Dictators are frequently unaware of the realities within their countries, a phenomenon known as the dictator's dilemma. They are typically surrounded by people eager to please them, constantly offering praise. As a result, dictators remain oblivious to the true state of affairs and continue making one wrong decision after another. It would not be incorrect to say that dictators often sow the seeds of their own downfall. However, in reality, the end of a dictatorship does not guarantee freedom for the people. Whether or not freedom and a better future follow depends entirely on the will of the people themselves. We hope that Syrians will now have the opportunity for a better life and a better government. Whoever becomes the next leader of Syria, let's hope they will be better than those who came before. But will this truly happen? Only time will tell. If you'd like to delve deeper into Middle Eastern geopolitics, exploring the 3 regional powers, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Iran, their relationships, conflicts, and how these dynamics affect neighboring countries, I will explain this in detail in another video.